The classroom aboard the Xynarth Institute of Galactic Studies pulsed with tension. Hovering display panels flickered with animated diagrams of creatures from distant systems, but no one paid them any attention. All eyes compound, luminescent, slit, and otherwise were fixed on the containment field at the center of the crystalline dais. Inside was the Scarverin Blightfang. The creature's red eyes blazed with defiance as it paced, tail lashing against the energy field with ominous thuds. Its armored scales gleamed like darkened steel, and its jagged fangs dripping with neurotoxin caught the sterile light. Every time it moved, its claws left gouges on the reinforced floor, proof of its destructive potential. Professor Ormex, a gelatinous tritherin whose bioluminescent ripples served as speech, addressed the room. The Blightfang the professor pulsed, glowing in a steady blue, has defeated every training attempt in galactic history. Those foolish enough to try were left with scars if they were lucky. The class of alien students murmured among themselves. Even the boldest species among them shrank in their seats, unwilling to challenge the creature's infamous reputation. All except one. Jackson Reese, the only human exchange student at the Xynarth Institute, leaned forward in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. While his classmates avoided eye contact with the monster, Jackson seemed almost intrigued. "You're awfully quiet for a species known for reckless confidence," sneered Melgaris, a translucent Cerithian with a voice like breaking glass. Its elongated fingers waved dismissively at the human. "Don't tell me you're intimidated, little earthling." Jackson grinned. "Not intimidated, just thinking." Melgaris rolled its multifaceted eyes. "Thinking about what? Your obituary." Before Jackson could answer, Professor Ormex pulsed a sharper blue, commanding attention. The Xynarth Institute has declared this creature untamable. The Blightfang's neural patterns are too erratic, its instincts too volatile. Yet, the professor's glow dimmed slightly. "For those who wish to try, this is your chance to make history." The room fell silent. Finally, Jackson stood. He was shorter than most of his classmates and lacked the imposing physical features of their species. Where others had spines, talons, or bioluminescent crests, Jackson had a mop of dark hair and a plain uniform that somehow looked out of place. "I'll do it," he said. The declaration rippled through the room like a plasma surge. Melgaris chittered with laughter. "You? A human? The Blightfang will eat you before you manage a single command." Jackson turned to face the Cerithian. "You seem pretty confident for someone who's still sitting down." Melgaris hissed, but Jackson was already stepping toward the dais. Professor Ormex vibrated with uncertainty. "Human Jackson, I must remind you that the Blightfang is extremely dangerous. The containment field is designed to protect observers, not participants. If you insist on proceeding, we will require a formal waiver of liability." Jackson shrugged. "Got it. Where do I sign?" A glowing contract materialized, and Jackson scribbled his name without hesitation. The professor gave a resigned flicker, signaling for the containment field to be adjusted. As the energy barrier shimmered, retracting just enough for Jackson to approach, the Blightfang roared a sound so deep and guttural that it seemed to shake the room itself. Jackson stopped a few meters from the creature, close enough to feel the heat radiating from its scales. "Before you begin," Professor Ormex pulsed, "what tools will you require? Perhaps a neural dampener? A shock lance?" Jackson shook his head. "Nope. Just a few items I brought with me." He opened a small bag slung over his shoulder and began pulling out objects. The first was a rubber duck. A ripple of confusion swept through the room. "Hey, what is that?" asked Vrilnath, a shadowy entity whose voice sounded like static interference. "A rubber duck," Jackson replied. Its squeaks, he gave it a quick squeeze, and the absurd sound echoed through the room. "Is this some kind of joke?" demanded Melgaris. "Not a joke," Jackson said calmly, "just part of the plan." Next, he pulled out a spool of high tensile wire, a ball of yarn, and several small containers filled with an unidentifiable meat paste. He laid them out in front of him, ignoring the incredulous stares from his classmates. "Human Jackson," Professor Ormex began hesitantly, I must insist on a more conventional approach. Conventional hasn't worked, Jackson replied, stepping closer to the Blightfang. Let's try unconventional. The creature's crimson eyes locked onto him, unblinking. Its claws flexed, and it let out a low growl. Jackson could feel the weight of its hostility pressing against him, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he crouched down, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He reached into his bag and pulled out a chunk of meat paste, tossing it a few feet in front of the creature. The Blightfang stopped growling. It sniffed the air cautiously, its tail twitching. Good start, Jackson muttered to himself. He pulled out the ball of yarn and rolled it toward the creature, the bright red thread stark against the metallic floor. The Blightfang growled again, this time softer. It swatted the ball with one claw, then jerked its head back as though surprised. The reaction drew murmurs from the crowd. Impossible, Melgaris hissed. Not impossible, Jackson said, pulling out the rubber duck. He gave it another squeak, the sound cutting through the tension in the room. The Blightfang tilted its head, its feral gaze momentarily replaced with something almost curious. The crowd leaned forward in their seats, unable to look away. Jackson slowly reached for the spool of wire, fashioning it into a loop. The Blightfang's eyes followed every movement. You're smarter than they give you credit for, Jackson said softly, as though the creature could understand him. The Blightfang sniffed the loop cautiously, its massive claws brushing against it. Jackson didn't pull away. Instead, he tapped the ground lightly, a rhythmic pattern that seemed to catch the creature's attention. To the shock of everyone watching, the Blightfang clicked its claws in response. Professor Ormex glowed a bright gold, the Tritherian equivalent of astonishment. Did it just respond? Jackson grinned. Yup, told you. Unconventional. The Blightfang nudged the ball of yarn, its growl softening into a low rumble. The lethal predator once deemed untamable was playing. The room erupted into chaos. The classroom was abuzz with wild speculation the next morning. News of Jackson's encounter with the Scarveran Blightfang had spread throughout the Xynarth Institute like an ion storm. Every corner of the crystalline halls echoed with incredulous whispers. Did you hear? The human made a Blightfang play fetch. No way. He probably drugged it. I heard it purred. Blightfangs don't purr. In the center of the commotion sat Jackson Reese, unfazed by the stares and murmurs as he unpacked his things for class. His fellow students had gathered in small cliques, watching him like he was some sort of enigma. Melgaris, the translucent Srithian, glided over with a smug grin. So, what's the trick, human? Hypnotics? Neural implants? Or are you just trying to build your reputation before you inevitably get shredded by the next challenge? Jackson gave him an easygoing smile. No tricks. Just patience, observation, and a rubber duck. The response earned a chorus of chittering laughter from nearby students. Melgaris rolled its multifaceted eyes and muttered something about primitive theatrics, but Jackson ignored the jab. Before anyone could press him further, Professor Ormex glided into the room, their bioluminescent glow pulsing with purpose. The class fell silent. Students. The professor began, it seems our human guest has stirred. Considerable debate. Yesterday's demonstration was unprecedented. Today we'll delve into how such results might redefine our approach to untamable species. As Ormex spoke, a holographic projection of the Blightfang shimmered to life above the crystalline dais. The image rotated slowly, highlighting its jagged claws and spiked tail. The Scarveran Blightfang has long been classified as a Class 4 hazardous species, intelligent but impossible to train due to its unpredictable aggression. The projection shifted, now showing a clip of Jackson's encounter. Gasps rippled through the room as the hologram replayed the Blightfang nudging the ball of yarn and clicking its claws in rhythm. How did this happen? Ormex pulsed, their glow shifting to a curious green. Was it a fluke? Or has this human uncovered a fundamental truth about this species? Jackson raised his hand. I think it's neither. All eyes turned to him. Explain, Ormex said, their tone bright with intrigue. Everyone treats the Blightfang like a problem to solve, Jackson began, standing to address the room. But it's not a problem. It's a creature with instincts, needs, and intelligence. Instead of trying to control it, I just worked with it. Melgaris snorted. Worked with it? You threw toys at it. Jackson chuckled. Yeah, I threw toys. Because it needed something to focus on, something to engage its brain. Blightfangs aren't mindless, they're just misunderstood. The room buzzed with whispers. Prove it, said a deep voice from the back. It belonged to Gorthan, a hulking Avarath with leathery skin and tusks the size of plasma rifles. If you're so confident, show us it wasn't a one-time thing. Professor Ormex pulsed a contemplative amber. An excellent suggestion. Mr. Reese, are you prepared to replicate your results in a controlled environment? Jackson hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Let's do it. An hour later, Jackson found himself in the Institute's training arena, a massive chamber lined with observation platforms and energy barriers. At the center of the room stood a containment pod, its reinforced walls humming with static electricity. Inside was another Blightfang larger and meaner than the first. This one's tail was jagged from years of battles, and its crimson eyes burned with an intensity that made the first Blightfang look like a house pet. A crowd had gathered in the observation deck, including students, faculty, and even a few administrative officials. The buzz of conversation filled the chamber as everyone speculated on whether Jackson could repeat his apparent miracle. Good luck, Melgaris called mockingly from the sidelines. You'll need it. Jackson ignored him, stepping into the center of the arena. The containment pod hissed open, and the Blightfang emerged with a thunderous roar. Its claws scraped the floor, and its spike tail swung dangerously close to the energy barrier. All right, big guy, Jackson muttered to himself. Let's see what makes you tick. He began by crouching low, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. From his bag, he pulled out the same arsenal he'd used before: a ball of yarn, a container of meat paste, and the trusty rubber duck. The Blightfang snarled, lunging forward, but Jackson didn't flinch. Instead, he placed the ball of yarn on the ground and gently rolled it toward the creature. For a moment, nothing happened. The Blightfang's eyes narrowed, and its tail flicked sharply, leaving a deep gouge in the arena floor. The crowd held its breath. Then, the creature sniffed the yarn. Slowly, cautiously, it extended a claw and batted the ball. A ripple of astonishment swept through the audience. Unbelievable, someone murmured. But Jackson wasn't finished. He pulled out the rubber duck and squeezed it, letting its comical squeak echo through the chamber. The Blightfang's head snapped toward him, its ears twitching. Jackson squeezed the duck again, this time tossing it just out of reach. The Blightfang hesitated, then padded forward, sniffing the toy. It let out a low rumble, somewhere between a growl and a purr. Jackson grinned. That's it! You're not so scary after all, huh? The creature looked up at him, its crimson eyes losing their hostility. Slowly, it lowered itself to the ground, curling its spiked tail around the ball of yarn and nudging the rubber duck with its snout. The crowd erupted into cheers and incredulous whispers. Even Professor Ormex's glow pulsed with excitement. Extraordinary, the professor exclaimed. This is no mere coincidence. The human has demonstrated a replicable method for engaging the Blightfang's intelligence. Jackson stood and brushed off his hands. Told you. It's not about domination. It's about connection. From the observation deck, Melgaris glared, his translucent skin darkening with embarrassment. Meanwhile, Gorthan, the hulking Avarath, let out a rumbling laugh. Well done, human. You've earned my respect, something not easily given. Jackson gave a casual salute. Appreciate it. As the crowd dispersed, Professor Ormex approached Jackson with a thoughtful glow. Mr. Reese, your methods are groundbreaking. The faculty is already discussing the potential applications of your approach. However, there is one matter that requires your attention. What's that? Jackson asked. The Intergalactic Council has requested a demonstration. They believe your success could redefine how we approach species once thought untamable. Jackson blinked. The Intergalactic Council? That sounds intense. It is, Ormex replied, and they will expect results. Jackson glanced at the Blightfang, now happily chewing on the rubber duck. Well, he said with a grin, I guess I better bring my A-game. The Intergalactic Research Council chamber was both awe-inspiring and intimidating. The amphitheater, carved from a single slab of crystalline material, spiraled upward into tiers filled with representatives from every corner of the known galaxy. Creatures of every conceivable form and size occupied the chamber, beings of light, hovering in containment fields, aquatic species suspended in levitating water pods, and sentient insectoids with shimmering exoskeletons. Above them, a holographic projection of the galaxy spun slowly, as if reminding everyone of the vastness they sought to understand. In the center of the chamber, Jackson stood on a raised platform. Beside him was a reinforced containment pod. Inside it, the Mervan, spiked, six-eyed, and notoriously territorial, pinned him with its predatory gaze. The stakes had never felt higher. Mr. Reese of Earth, said Althorin, the council leader, her crystalline form refracting light with every word. Her voice rang out like resonating chimes. You stand before this council as a representative of your species. You claim to have achieved what no other researcher in galactic history has, taming the untamable. Jackson cleared his throat. Not taming. Understanding. A murmur rippled through the chamber, accompanied by flickers of bioluminescence and gesturing appendages. The counselors leaned closer, their skepticism palpable. Very well, Althorin said. You have been granted this audience to demonstrate your methods. Be advised, the council does not tolerate hoaxes. If your claims prove false, the consequences will be severe. Understood, Jackson said, swallowing hard. Vorlex, the silver-shelled dean of xenobiology, sat in the first row. His compound eyes betrayed no emotion, but Jackson felt the weight of the dean's expectations pressing down on him. No pressure, right? The containment pod hissed open, and the Mervan stepped out. It was larger than the one Jackson had worked with before, its barbed tail swaying menacingly. The creature's six eyes scanned its surroundings, its spiked limbs digging into the crystalline floor. A collective hush fell over the chamber. Jackson didn't move. He simply observed, letting the Mervan adjust to its new environment. Proceed, Mr. Reese Althorin said. Jackson crouched slightly, maintaining eye level with the creature without appearing confrontational. From his bag, he produced a small pouch of jelly-like treats. The Mervan hissed, its spiked tail lashing behind it. It's okay, Jackson said softly. He tossed one of the jelly orbs onto the platform, a few meters away from the creature. The Mervan froze, its nostrils flaring. It sniffed the air, then cautiously stepped forward. The chamber was so silent that Jackson could hear the faint clicks of its claws against the floor. The creature sniffed the treat, hesitated, and then swallowed it in a single gulp. A flicker of surprise passed through the audience. It appears to be cooperating, observed Quarn, a towering insectoid counselor whose mandibles clicked in disbelief. Jackson ignored the commentary, reaching into his bag again. This time he pulled out a whistle. It was an unassuming object, made of polished metal, but Jackson held it with the reverence of a master craftsman unveiling a prized tool. He blew a series of short, melodic notes. The sound echoed through the chamber, and the Mervan's head tilted slightly. Its six eyes locked onto Jackson, its tail stilling. Good, Jackson murmured. He repeated the sequence, then added a small gesture with his hand, motioning for the Mervan to lower itself. To the astonishment of everyone present, the creature obeyed. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Vorlex leaned forward, his compound eyes gleaming with interest. Althorin's crystalline form pulsed faintly, a signal of her intrigue. Jackson stepped closer to the Mervan, offering another treat. The creature accepted it calmly, its posture relaxed. Slowly, Jackson extended his hand, palm up, and tapped the ground in a rhythmic pattern. The Mervan hesitated for a moment, then clicked its claws in response. The chamber erupted in chaos. Impossible, hissed Quarn. Is this a trick? Demanded a gelatinous representative whose body rippled with agitation. Silence. Althorn's voice rang out, restoring order. She turned to Jackson, her tone sharper. Explain this behavior human. Jackson straightened, his voice steady despite the tension. The mervan isn't a mindless predator. It's a highly territorial creature, but its aggression is a defense mechanism. When I approached it, I didn't try to dominate or intimidate it. I treated it like a sentient being with preferences and boundaries. He pointed to the holographic display above the platform, which now showed close-up footage of the mervan's subtle reactions, its twitching tail, its shifting eyes, the way its claws flexed in response to stimuli. Notice the clicking pattern, Jackson continued. It's not random. It's a form of communication. Once I mimicked it, the mervan began to see me as part of its environment rather than a threat. The counselors whispered among themselves, their skepticism waning. But this doesn't prove universal applicability, Quarn argued. What if this is a one-off anomaly, a fluke? Then let's test it, Jackson said. The chamber fell silent again. Althorn tilted her head, her crystalline body refracting a spectrum of colors. You are proposing another demonstration. Yes, Jackson said. Bring another mervan. One I've never worked with before. The council deliberated briefly before signaling to the attendants. A second containment pod was wheeled into the chamber, this one housing a visibly agitated mervan. Its spiked tail slammed against the walls of the pod, leaving scorch marks. Proceed, Althorn said, though her tone carried a note of doubt. The pod opened, and the second mervan stormed out. It was larger and more aggressive than the first, its growls reverberating through the chamber. Jackson didn't flinch. He crouched again, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He tapped the floor in the same rhythmic pattern. The mervan froze, its head tilting. Encouraged, Jackson tossed a jelly orb toward it. The creature sniffed the treat but didn't eat it immediately. Instead, it stared at Jackson, as if weighing its options. Jackson tapped the floor again, this time adding a soft whistle. The mervan hesitated, then clicked its claws just once. A wave of astonishment swept through the audience. Jackson stepped closer, extending his hand. The mervan's claws brushed against his palm, its posture softening. It's about trust, Jackson said, his voice carrying through the chamber, not control. Once you meet them halfway, they respond. The mervan lowered itself to the ground, its barbed tail curling around its body. The chamber erupted into applause, an unprecedented display of emotion from the typically reserved counselors. Althorn rose, her crystalline form gleaming brightly. Mr. Reese, your methods have defied centuries of precedent. The implications of your work are profound. You have earned the council's respect. Jackson exhaled, relief washing over him. As the session concluded, Vorlex approached him. You've done well, Mr. Reese, the dean said, but be prepared. You've shattered long-held beliefs, and not everyone will embrace change easily. Jackson smiled. That's okay. Humans are used to breaking rules. A week after the council session, Jackson's life had turned into a whirlwind of attention. What had started as a risky personal challenge to understand the mervan had become a galactic phenomenon. His methods sparked fierce debates across academic institutions. Some praised his ingenuity, calling it a revolution in xenoecology. Others dismissed it as reckless human bravado. Regardless, his success was impossible to ignore, and requests for interviews, collaborations, and demonstrations poured in from every corner of the galaxy. Jackson, however, spent his days back at the Xynarth Institute, trying to focus on his studies. His research partner, the now famous Mervin nicknamed Spike by the students, had settled into its new routine surprisingly well. It no longer hissed at every passerby, and even seemed to enjoy rolling a ball of yarn Jackson kept on his desk. One afternoon, as Jackson sat reviewing data on Spike's behavioral patterns, Professor Elixia entered the lab. Her bioluminescent crest glowed faintly with amusement as she watched Spike nudge the ball of yarn toward Jackson, clicking its claws softly. You've done something remarkable, Mr. Reese, she said. Thanks, Jackson replied, glancing up. but I'm guessing you're not here just to compliment me. Elixia's crest shimmered. You guessed correctly. The Council has convened an extraordinary session to discuss the implications of your methods. Jackson groaned. More meetings? I thought proving the Mervan could be understood was enough. This is bigger than the Mervan, Elixia said. Your success challenges centuries of accepted knowledge. If your methods can be applied to other species, it could transform how we interact with life forms across the galaxy. Jackson leaned back in his chair, letting that sink in. The idea was both thrilling and daunting. What's the catch, he asked. Elixia's crest dimmed slightly. Not everyone supports this shift. The Dravian Institute, among others, has issued formal challenges to your findings. They've accused you of relying on theatrics rather than science. You'll need to demonstrate your methods again, this time on a much larger scale. Jackson sighed. Let me guess, they've picked the hardest possible creature to work with. Elixia's wings fluttered. Naturally. The trial took place in the Dravian Institute's massive biocontainment arena. The event was broadcast across the galaxy, with billions of viewers tuning in. The arena, a sprawling dome reinforced with energy shields, was designed to house even the most dangerous lifeforms. Jackson stood in the center, feeling the weight of the galaxy's gaze. Around him, holographic projections displayed statistics and commentary on the creature he was about to face, the Tenebral Hydra. The Hydra was a multi-headed predator from a volatile star system, infamous for its unpredictability and aggression. Each head had its own neural pathways, making communication with the creature an almost impossible task. Great Jackson muttered under his breath. Because one head wasn't enough. The Hydra's containment field was deactivated, and the creature emerged with a guttural roar. It was enormous, its 5 heads snapping at the air as its sleek, scaled body coiled around itself. The crowd watched in hushed anticipation. Dr. Lonthar, the lead researcher at the Dravian Institute, addressed the audience. Ladies and gentle beings, observe as the human so-called methods fail against a creature with no central consciousness. Jackson tuned out the jeers and focused on the Hydra. It was agitated, its movements erratic. He could feel the tension radiating from its coiled form. He started with the basics. Slowly he crouched and began tapping the ground in a rhythmic pattern, the same way he had with the Mervan. The Hydra's head snapped toward him, their eyes narrowing. Hey big guy, Jackson said softly. Let's not make this harder than it has to be. One of the heads hissed, baring razor-sharp fangs. Jackson responded by tossing a chunk of meat onto the ground. The Hydra hesitated, then lunged for the treat, swallowing it in one gulp. Good start, Jackson muttered. He reached into his bag and pulled out another tool, a laser pointer. He clicked it on, directing the red beam toward the floor. One of the Hydra's heads immediately followed the dot, tilting curiously. Jackson moved the pointer in slow, looping patterns, and soon, 3 of the heads were tracking it. The audience erupted in murmurs. He's distracting it, Lonthar accused. Engaging it, Jackson corrected, his voice steady. He continued the game, gradually introducing a series of whistles and taps. The Hydra's movements became less erratic, its heads responding to his cues with surprising synchronicity. One by one, they clicked their jaws in rhythmic patterns, mirroring Jackson's signals. Impossible, Lonthar muttered, his confidence visibly shaken. After nearly 30 minutes, the Hydra's once feral energy had transformed into focused attentiveness. It followed Jackson's commands, curling and uncurling its body in intricate patterns. The final test came when Jackson crouched low and extended his hand. One of the heads dipped down, its massive snout brushing against his palm. The crowd erupted into applause, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the arena. In the aftermath of the trial, Jackson's methods were declared a breakthrough. The galactic community began adopting his approach, sparking a wave of new research into interspecies communication. Creatures once thought untamable were reclassified as misunderstood, and the divide between sentient beings and wildlife began to blur. Back at the Xynarth Institute, Jackson finally had a moment to breathe. He sat in the lab with Spike, who was happily nudging a ball of yarn across the floor. Professor Elixia entered, her crest glowing warmly. "The galaxy owes you a great debt, Mr. Reese." "Don't mention it," Jackson said, tossing Spike a jelly orb. "But tell me," Elixia continued, "what will you do now?" Jackson grinned. "Oh, I've got ideas. Maybe I'll see if I can get Spike to teach me something for a change." Spike clicked its claws in response, and for the first time Jackson could have sworn the creature was smiling.